Jingle, jingle, friends! Welcome to Holidays at Harmony Hills Home and Garden. I'm Jenny, and we live and celebrate here in Baltimore, Maryland, Zone 7. In today's video, I'm going to attempt to make some home decor out of some garden elements. These are some things I've gathered from our garden or from other places that we've been lately. So come with us and let's see what we can build. Have you been out in the home decor stores and you've seen these signs that are made out of materials like this? Sometimes they're wood letters, sometimes they're paper mache letters or other things. And the O often is made out of a wreath or a snowflake or a star or something like that. I'm going to try to make a sign that says joy, and I'm going to be using these two paper mache letters that I picked up at the craft store. I have a grapevine wreath. I think it's a little bigger than I want, so I'm going to be modifying that. I also gathered just a few supplies. I've got a berry wreath, some greenery, a couple of different kinds and colors of paint brushes. I have this bag full of moss and bark with lichen on it that I gathered while we were in Cape Cod a couple of weeks ago. And I also have this bag full of branches, some of which have pine cones on it, some of them which have pine needles on it, and others of that have lichens and moss and stuff on it. So those are the materials I'm starting with. Of course, I also have my wire cutters and some paddle wire. This is, I think, 26 gauge, 24 gauge, so pretty small gauge wire. And I might be gathering up some other supplies that I don't know that I need until I come across the need for them. So on this project, I'm really not going to be narrating a whole lot. I'm just going to be doing it and filming it, and then I'll do some voiceovers because honestly, I don't know how this project is going to go. So let's just experiment and see how this turns out. This grapevine wreath is a little bit bigger than what I really want it to be. And I know that if I soak it in some water, some hot water especially, then it'll soften it up and make it more pliable so that I can take it apart and then reconfigure it in the way that I want. So I'm just going to toss this in the water and let it soak for quite some time. I've decided to paint the letters. I'm using metallic acrylic paint in gold color. And I thought I would use the gold around the outside edges of each of the letters. Now my plan is for the front face of these letters to be a faux birch bark look using paint. But for the edges, I'm going to just go ahead and paint them gold so that they'll have a nice holiday look and feel to them. The first step for the birch bark is a black acrylic paint. Now I looked online and I found a couple of different tutorials for how to paint a faux birch bark look. And the first thing you do is you put dark colors down on the base and you just kind of scatter them out. And there is nothing precise about this. You just put blobs and blobs. I tried to make them a little bit swooshy, a little bit like horizontal, like the horizontal markings on a birch bark trunk. And you definitely don't need to cover the entire surface. So I'm just splotching on here and just kind of, it ends up looking a little bit like camouflage before you're all done. The next color, I wanted some gray, so I just took some white acrylic paint and mixed it into the gray, mixed it into the black to make a nice gray. And now I'm making a next layer of gray paint. I'm concentrating on the areas where the black isn't yet covered, so hitting that paper mache with the gray. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to kind of be messy like nature is messy. In the tutorials that I looked at, the next step was to add a beige color, but since I'm using that gold around the edges, I thought I'd use that gold metallic paint as my beige. Now at this point I went back in with a little bit of black because I thought that I had gotten too much beige and gray on there. Okay, so while the paint is drying, it's time to address the grapevine. I had weighed it down with a plate so that it wouldn't float, so that the whole thing would get wet. Now I'm testing it here to see how rigid or flexible it is, and I think it's pretty good to use, so I attempted to cut it apart with my kitchen shears. That was a no-go, so I went and got my Felcos. Ah yeah, that's much better. So then I just took off this outer wrap of thick stem, and it came apart in a couple of different pieces. Okay, so now I had that wrapping off. Now I could take this grapevine wreath apart. So it's really just a coil of grapevine material that comes from nature, and usually one end of it is the main one stem, and then it branches off of that one main stem and becomes many, many smaller branches. And that's exactly what I found when I pulled apart this wreath. As you can see toward the other end of it, it's lots and lots of branches all connected together. And it looks and acts just a little bit like a slinky at this point. Now it's time to make the newer, smaller wreath. So I find the end, that single stem where the whole plant originated from, and then I bend it into a smaller sized O. Hold it together taut so that nothing springs apart, and then curl it around and make it the size that I need for my project. Now I have it the size that I want it roughly. So I make sure that my starting end is in my hand underneath that zip tie, and I'm going to use a zip tie to fasten off this new wreath. Okay, and now I can trim off the excess grapevine, and now I have a newer, smaller wreath. It's smaller diameter, and it has fewer stems in it, so it's actually quite a bit smaller than the original. By this time, my letters are dry and they're ready for the next coat. So I'm using some white, and this is going to be the top layer of the birch bark. And I'm, again, just going to use my sponge brush and just kind of dab it on in horizontal stripes fashion, and letting some of those darker colors peek through the white paint. Now I could have stopped here, but I thought I wanted a little bit of texture, so I decided to use some chalk paint in a just barely off-white color to add some more texture and just a different shade of a color onto the top. So the J and the Y are painted and the wreath is formed, but I thought the wreath needed one more tie on it just to make sure that it didn't pop apart, and also to make sure I knew exactly where the bottom was going to be. So I put another zip tie on there just to keep it a little bit more secure. Okay, time to decorate the wreath. I got this 5-foot long faux berry branch garland at Michael's. I did not pay full price for it. I'm just going to kind of stretch it out and see how long it needs to be, and then trim it off at the correct length. Alright, so I find the end of the berry garland and I put it on the back of the wreath. And now it's time to use the paddle wire to wire the garland onto the wreath. Just twist that on there real good. And then I'm just going to leave that wire connected to the paddle and use it to wrap around the garland, around the wreath, all the way around. Now, as I'm wrapping this wire around, I lift up those berry branches so that they don't get pinned down by the wire. I want them to be able to be moved around, to be kind of molded into a shape that's more pleasing. So I'm sure to lift those up before I wrap around the stem of the garland onto the wreath. And then I just keep doing this all the way around until I get back to the beginning. Alright, and I've gotten back to the beginning now, so I cut off the wire and then twist the end with the beginning wire and just hide it on the back of the wreath. And now I can take those berry branches and form them back into a nice wreath around the grapevine. Just play around with this until it looks like you like it. And now that O is done, and it looks really cute between the two letters for making the rest of the word. Okay, now the letters are done, but they need to be put onto some sort of board so they can stand up and look pretty on the shelf. So I need to figure out how long to make the board. I laid the letters out where I want them, and I decided I want my board to be 24 inches long. Out to the scrap pile I go. These are pieces of an old picnic table that we used to have in our backyard that we cut apart, and I'm just looking for a board that's about 24 inches long. I didn't find any exactly the length I needed, so I decided to use one that was a little longer and then just cut it to the right length. There's nothing particularly perfect about this piece of wood. I just gave it a brush off with a bristle brush and then a wire brush just to get the big chunks of dirt off, and then it was ready for me to use. Once I got the board inside, I tested it out to make sure that the letters were going to look nice on there. And then I started gathering my materials, which are the bark and moss and lichen that I picked up on my foraging trip in Cape Cod. Now I want to cover this board with this bark, but when I put the letters on the board and then put the bark up next to it, I was worried that my letters were going to be hidden too much, so I needed to raise them up off the board somehow. So I'm going to use some styrofoam to raise up the letters, and the bark should cover up the styrofoam and be level with the letters. I cut a little channel in the styrofoam so that the wreath could sit in that, and that gave me a really nice solid surface to put that wreath onto the board with. And with the letters now in place, it's time to cover that board with the bark and the moss and the lichen. And there's absolutely nothing special or secret or fancy about how I did this. I just picked up pieces of the bark from the collection that I had made, and I found the ones that I thought would cover up those styrofoam bases, the ones that looked like it had more moss interest on it or more lichen on it, whatever. And I just pieced them together like a jigsaw puzzle, and I glued them on to the board with hot glue. Now, yeah, this bark was a little bit moist from being in a plastic bag, and the board was a little bit moist from being out in the rain. I did not take any care to dry things out or even to get rid of any bugs. I, in fact, found a couple of bugs crawling across the countertop while I was working on this project. So you may not want to do it that way. You might find a better way to do it. But for me, this sign will last this season. If it doesn't last into next year, I'm okay with that. I had fun making it, and I think it's going to be pretty for this season at least. After a while, I finally had all of the surfaces of that wooden plank covered, and I was pretty happy with the way it looked. Okay, now the next step is to finish decorating that wreath. I wanted to put some faux greenery on it. This is a bush pick that I got at Michael's, and it's just greenery with some pine cones on it. I'm cutting it apart, getting some branches separated so that I can glue them in one at a time. Okay, that's a good first step. What else do I want to add? I was thinking about adding this stick that had lichen growing on it, but I couldn't really figure out how to make it look nice, so I abandoned that idea. Put it back in the pile. Pine cones seemed like a much better idea. These are the pine cones that came off of the pitch pines that I picked up while I was foraging on Cape Cod. Now I had this branch that had pine needles still on it with the pine cones, and I thought that was really cute. And I was thinking about incorporating that with the pine needles on it. But then the more I got to looking at them, the more I realized they were already drying out and starting to fall off, and I didn't think they would last the whole season, much less until next year. So I decided to just go with the pine cones themselves.
So now I thought it was time to add some more greenery to the arrangement, and I played around with a few different ways to add some of those sprigs to the outside edges. Now, a lot of people get all frustrated and think they can't do this kind of crafting because they don't know how to do it correctly, but I'm here to tell you, if you like the way it looks, then it's correct. You don't have to make it look good to anybody else's eyes but yours. So just have fun with it, play around, try different things, stretch yourself, and who knows what you'll come up with. It might be just the best thing ever. And so with that, I think it's done.
Given that I didn't really know what I was going to be doing today, I think this turned out pretty cute. Got the faux birch bark painting with the gold edges. We've got the bark covered, kind of a log looking thing, and some pine cones and different natural elements. So what do you think? I'm pretty happy with it. So yeah, let me know in the comment section below if you have ideas. Have you done something like this? Are you crafting with natural materials? Let me know what you're doing. This is the official kickoff to my joyful season. I hope that you have a joyful season too. And I'll see you again in another video real soon. Take care, friends. Bye.